Serena's world shattered the moment her father grabbed her wrist in the middle of the market square, his fingers digging into her flesh as he dragged her toward the center where everyone could see. The bell from the manor house had just finished its third and final toll, the ancient call of the old pact, and now her father's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd, declaring that she would be delivered to the Lord of the Heights as punishment for bringing shame to their family. The words hit her like physical blows: shame, punishment, delivered, as if she were nothing more than spoiled grain to be discarded. Around them, the market came to a standstill. Vendors abandoned their fruit stalls, children stopped their games, and the elderly women who gathered near the fountain to exchange gossip fell silent, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers under their breath. Others leaned forward, hungry for every detail of her humiliation. Serena felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of everyone. She had learned long ago that tears only made things worse, gave them more ammunition for their cruel whispers. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the cobblestones beneath her feet, counting the cracks in the stone as her father continued his public condemnation. "She has brought nothing but disgrace to our name," he announced, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "The Lord of the Heights will know what to do with her." The murmurs began immediately, a low buzz of speculation and judgment that made Serena's skin crawl. She heard fragments of their conversations, words that cut deeper than any blade. "Always knew she was trouble. Look at her, no wonder. What did she do this time? Poor man, having to deal with such a daughter." Her hand instinctively went to the opaque stone pendant that hung around her neck, the only thing her mother had left her. The familiar weight of it against her palm provided a small measure of comfort, a reminder that once someone had loved her unconditionally. The stone was warm against her skin, as it always was, though she had never understood why. Then the air changed. A chill swept through the square despite the late afternoon heat, and the chatter died away to an expectant hush. Serena felt the fine hairs on her arms stand up, and when she finally lifted her head, she saw why. A black wooden carriage had appeared at the top of the hill, moving without sound down the winding path toward the village. It was an impossible thing. All sharp angles and midnight wood, drawn by horses so dark they seemed to absorb the light around them. The sight of it sent a collective shiver through the crowd, and several people took involuntary steps backward. The carriage came to a stop at the edge of the square, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the nervous shuffling of feet and the distant bleating of goats in the fields beyond the village. Then the door opened. The figure that emerged was tall and imposing, draped in a dark cloak that seemed to move independently of any breeze. His face was partially hidden by shadows, but Serena could see the strong line of his jaw, the aristocratic angle of his cheekbones. When he moved, it was with a fluid grace that spoke of predatory strength held in careful check. This was the Lord of the Heights, the Vampire Alpha, as the old ones called him when they thought no one was listening. The creature of legend and nightmare who ruled from the ancient manor that loomed over their valley like a storm cloud. He should have been terrifying, and he was, but not in the way Serena had expected. Instead of the monster of children's stories, she saw something almost weary in the set of his shoulders. He moved through the crowd with measured steps, and people parted before him like water, their fear palpable in the air. But his attention was focused solely on her, and as he drew closer, Serena found herself unable to look away. When he finally stood before her, she expected him to address her father, to discuss terms or conditions as if she were livestock being sold at auction. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone present, including Serena herself. He looked directly into her eyes and spoke to her. "I did not come because you were offered," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square despite its quiet tone. There was an accent there, something old and refined that spoke of centuries and distant places. "I came because I choose you." The words sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Choose? That wasn't how the old pact worked. The Lord of the Heights took what was given to him as tribute or punishment. He didn't choose. Serena stared up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. His eyes were darker than the night sky, but there was something in them, a recognition perhaps, or understanding, that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Not judged, not evaluated, simply seen. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his austere features into something almost gentle. "You will," he said simply. "But first, we must observe the proper forms." He turned then to address her father, and the temperature seemed to drop another few degrees. "Thomas of the Mill," he said, his voice formal now, carrying the weight of ancient protocol. "You have called upon the Old Pact to deliver your daughter as punishment for her supposed transgressions. I acknowledge your call, but I do not accept your terms." Her father's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "The pact is clear," he blustered. "When a family has been dishonored—" "The pact," the Lord interrupted, his voice cutting through Thomas's protests like a blade, "requires willing participation from all parties. Your daughter has not consented to this arrangement." "She doesn't need to consent," Thomas snapped. "She's my daughter, and she has brought shame upon—" "What shame?" The question came from the Lord, but his gaze never left Serena's face. What terrible crime has she committed that requires such drastic punishment? The silence stretched between them, and Serena felt every eye in the square fixed on their small group. This was the question she had been dreading, the one that would lay her failures bare for everyone to witness. But as she looked up into the Lord's dark eyes, she found an unexpected strength. "I refuse to marry Aldrich the baker's son," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. When he tried to force his attentions on me behind the granary, I fought back and broke his nose." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Self-defense was one thing, but to strike the son of one of the village's most respected families? That was scandal indeed. "And for this," the Lord said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been amusement, "you were to be delivered to me as punishment?" Serena nodded, not trusting her voice. She waited for the judgment, the condemnation that would surely follow. But instead, the Lord did something that no one expected. He laughed. It wasn't the cold, mocking laughter she had expected from a creature of darkness. It was rich and genuine, the sound of someone who had found something truly amusing in an otherwise grim situation. "A woman who defends her honor against unwanted advances," he said, addressing the crowd now. How terrible indeed. Clearly, such courage and self-respect cannot be tolerated in civilized society. The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, and several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. When put like that, Serena's crime seemed rather less scandalous and more reasonable. Her father's face was now a mottled red with embarrassment and rage. "The boy's family demands satisfaction," he said through gritted teeth. "The marriage contract was negotiated without the bride's consent," the Lord finished smoothly, "which, according to the laws that predate even the Old Pact, makes it invalid." He turned back to Serena, and his expression grew serious. "But you, Serena of the Mill, have a choice to make. You can remain here, subject to your father's continued efforts to marry you off to whoever will have you. Or you can come with me to the manor, where you will be treated with the respect due to a woman of courage and principle." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what she would do. Her father's face was murderous, and she knew that if she stayed, her life would become even more unbearable than it already was. He would find ways to punish her for this public humiliation, ways to make her regret her defiance. But the alternative was the stuff of nightmares. The Lord of the Heights was a vampire, a creature of darkness and blood. The stories about his kind were enough to make strong men cross themselves and children hide under their blankets. Yet as she looked up at him, she saw none of the monster she had expected. Instead, she saw someone who had looked at her situation and found it unjust, someone who had offered her a choice when no one else would. "What would be expected of me?" she asked, proud that her voice didn't shake. Conversation, he said simply. Your thoughts, your opinions, your insights into the ways of your people. I have need of someone who understands both justice and injustice, who has experienced both community and isolation. It wasn't what she had expected. Not a demand for service or submission, but a request for her mind, her perspective. When had anyone ever valued those things in her? And if I choose to leave later, then you leave, he said without hesitation. I am not in the business of keeping unwilling guests. Serena looked around the square, taking in the faces of the people who had known her all her life. Some showed pity, others curiosity, still others thinly veiled satisfaction at seeing her brought low. Her father's face was a mask of rage and humiliation, and she knew that there would be no forgiveness there, no matter what choice she made. The only person who had shown her any kindness in this whole wretched scene was the creature everyone told her to fear. I'll come with you, she said, the words tumbling out before she could lose her courage. A murmur went up from the crowd, a mixture of shock and disapproval. Her father stepped forward, his hand raised as if to strike her, but the Lord moved with inhuman speed to place himself between them. The lady has made her choice, he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. The old pact is satisfied. He offered Serena his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His cloak was surprisingly warm against her skin, and she could feel the solid strength of the muscle beneath the fabric. As they walked toward the carriage, she could hear the whispers starting up behind them. What will become of her? Poor child, she doesn't know what she's done. The Lord of the Heights. What could he want with her? But for the first time in years, Serena found she didn't care what they whispered. She was leaving this place, leaving behind the weight of their judgment and their small-minded cruelty. Whatever waited for her at the manor, it couldn't be worse than the slow suffocation of remaining here. The Lord handed her into the carriage with the same careful courtesy he had shown throughout their encounter, and as the door closed behind them, Serena caught a glimpse of her father's face through the window. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by his failure to control her fate. As the carriage began to move, carrying her away from the only life she had ever known, Serena touched the pendant at her throat again. The stone was warmer than ever, almost hot against her palm, and for a moment she could have sworn she felt it pulse like a heartbeat. The Lord noticed her gesture and smiled slightly. "Your mother's?" he asked. Serena nodded, surprised by the question. "How did you know?" "The stone," he said simply. "It recognizes its home." Before she could ask what he meant by that, the carriage crested the hill, and the manor came into view. It was larger than she had imagined, all towers and shadowed windows, but it wasn't the forbidding fortress of her nightmares. Instead, it looked almost welcoming. Lights flickered in several of the windows, and smoke rose from multiple chimneys, suggesting warmth and life within. "Welcome to your new home, Serena," the Lord said as they approached the great doors. "I think you'll find it quite different from what you've been told." As the carriage came to a stop and the doors of the manor swung open to reveal a figure in crisp household attire waiting to greet them, Serena realized that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. But for the first time in years, the change felt like possibility rather than punishment. The evening air carried the scent of rain on the horizon, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of water running over stone. It was the sound of life, of continuity, of things that endured beyond the petty cruelties of small minds and smaller hearts. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she was free. The woman who greeted them at the manor's entrance was nothing like Serena had expected. Instead of some cowering servant or supernatural creature, she found herself face to face with a middle-aged woman whose steel-gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun and whose sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She wore a simple but well-made dress in deep blue, and her bearing suggested someone accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Whitmore," the Lord said by way of introduction, "this is Serena. She will be staying with us for as long as she chooses." The housekeeper's gaze swept over Serena with professional assessment, but there was kindness there too. "Welcome, miss," she said with a slight curtsy. "I've prepared the rose room for you. I thought you might prefer something cheerful after today." The thoughtfulness of it nearly undid Serena's careful composure. When had anyone last considered her preferences? "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened. "You look done in, child. Come, let's get you settled and fed. Lord Damien, will you be dining tonight?" "I will take my usual refreshment later," he said. And Serena caught something meaningful in the exchange, though she couldn't quite grasp what. "Serena, please make yourself at home. We can speak tomorrow when you've had time to rest." As Mrs. Whitmore led her through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women in old-fashioned clothes, Serena found herself studying the details of her new surroundings. The manor was certainly grand, but it wasn't the cold, forbidding place she had imagined. Fires crackled in fireplaces, filling the air with warmth and the scent of burning applewood. Candles flickered in sconces along the walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. Fresh flowers, where had they come from at this time of year, brightened alcoves and side tables. "The Lord has specific rules about the household," Mrs. Whitmore said as they climbed a wide staircase. "They're for everyone's protection, including his own. He cannot enter any room unless invited. He does not feed from anyone within these walls without clear consent and proper ritual. All agreements must be made with both parties willing and aware." Serena stumbled slightly on the stairs. "Feed?" Mrs. Whitmore paused, turning to study her with those keen eyes. "You do know what he is, don't you, child?" "A vampire," Serena said, the word feeling strange on her tongue. "But I thought, the stories say—" "The stories say many things," Mrs. Whitmore replied diplomatically. "Most of them wrong. Lord Damien is indeed what you'd call a vampire, but he's nothing like the monsters in those tales. He's been the protector of this valley for longer than anyone alive can remember. The old pact exists because our ancestors recognized that cooperation served everyone better than conflict." They reached the landing, and Mrs. Whitmore opened a door to reveal a room that took Serena's breath away. It was painted in soft rose and cream, with a fire already crackling in the grate and windows that looked out over moonlit gardens. A four-poster bed dominated the space, covered in quilts that looked hand-stitched, and a small sitting area near the fireplace invited relaxation. "This was your mother's room," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. Serena spun around, her heart lurching. "My mother was here?" "Elena was the human consultant for nearly 5 years before she married your father," Mrs. Whitmore said, moving to light additional candles. "She was remarkable. Brilliant mind, fierce heart, and never afraid to speak truth to power, even when that power had fangs." The revelation hit Serena like a physical blow. Her mother had been here, in this very room, had sat by this same fireplace, looked out these same windows. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Your father forbade any mention of her work here," Mrs. Whitmore said, her tone suggesting what she thought of that decision. "Said it wasn't proper for the wife of a miller to have been involved in such things. But Elena was proud of what she accomplished. She helped negotiate water rights during the Great Drought, established the grain-sharing protocols that still keep the valley fed during lean times." Serena sank into one of the chairs by the fire, overwhelmed. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, her place in the world, was shifting like sand beneath her feet. What happened to her? "I mean, I know she died when I was small, but—" Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew sad. "Fever took her, poor thing. But not before she made me promise to look after you if you ever needed sanctuary. She said you had her gift for seeing through pretense to truth, and that someday you might need that gift to change things." "Change things how?" "That, child, is something you'll need to discover for yourself." Mrs. Whitmore moved toward the door. "For now, rest. There's a bathing chamber through that door, and I'll have food sent up. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Alone in her mother's room, Serena explored with reverent curiosity. The wardrobe contained several dresses in her size. Had Mrs. Whitmore anticipated her arrival? On the writing desk, she found a leather-bound journal with her mother's name embossed on the cover, and her heart nearly stopped. Inside were pages of careful notes about negotiations, observations about the balance between human and supernatural needs, and pressed flowers with annotations about their properties. But it was the last entry that made Serena's breath catch. The pendant I wear was given to me by the Council of Elders when I first accepted the position of consultant. It bears the seal of willing alliance, not subjugation, but partnership. Should anything happen to me, I hope Elena, who comes after, will understand that some bonds are chosen, not imposed. The stone grows warm when its wearer speaks truth in the face of power. It is meant to be worn by those who build bridges, not walls. Serena's hand went instinctively to her pendant, and sure enough, it was warm against her palm. She pulled it out to examine it more closely by candlelight, and for the first time noticed the tiny symbols etched around its edge. They were so small they were barely visible, but now that she looked closely, she could see they formed a pattern, a circle of clasped hands surrounding a tree with deep roots. Partnership, alliance, truth. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of her mother walking these same halls, speaking with quiet authority to figures in shadows. When Serena woke, pale sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the sounds of a household beginning its day drifted up from below. She dressed in one of the gowns from the wardrobe, a simple but elegant thing in deep green that fit her perfectly, and made her way downstairs following the sound of voices and the scent of baking bread. The kitchen was a revelation. It was enormous, with multiple hearths and work surfaces, but it felt warm and welcoming rather than institutional. Mrs. Whitmore was kneading dough at a flour-dusted table, while a younger woman, her daughter perhaps, tended something fragrant in a large pot over the fire. "Good morning, miss," Mrs. Whitmore said without looking up from her work. "Sleep well?" "Well enough," Serena replied, though it wasn't entirely true. "Mrs. Whitmore, yesterday Lord Damien mentioned needing someone who understood both justice and injustice. What did he mean?" The older woman's hands stilled for a moment. "The old pact has served this valley for generations, but like all old things, it's accumulated some barnacles that need scraping. There are provisions that made sense once, but now serve only to concentrate power in the wrong hands. Such as? The clause that allows families to deliver members as punishment," said a new voice from the doorway. Lord Damien stood there, though Serena hadn't heard him approach. In daylight, he looked less ethereal and more human. Still imposing, but the supernatural aura seemed muted. It was originally intended to prevent blood feuds by allowing neutral arbitration, but it's been corrupted into a tool for controlling women and anyone else deemed inconvenient. Serena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "So I wasn't the first." "No," he said gently, "and if nothing changes, you won't be the last." The weight of that settled over her like a cloak. Other women, other girls, trapped by the same system that had nearly destroyed her. What would it take to change it? "A new covenant," Damien said, moving into the kitchen with Mrs. Whitmore's obvious permission. "One that requires genuine consent from all parties and provides real alternatives to those seeking justice. But such changes require someone the community trusts to advocate for them." "Someone human," Serena said, understanding dawning. "Someone who has experienced the injustice firsthand and survived it with their principles intact." His dark eyes met hers. "Someone willing to stand before the Assembly of Rain and speak truth to power." The Assembly of Rain. Serena had heard of it, the traditional gathering held when the seasonal rains began, where the most important community decisions were made. It was still months away, but the mention of it sent a shiver through her. "And if I agreed to this?" she asked. "Then we would work together to prepare a proposal that serves everyone's needs," Damien said. "Better trade routes, improved water management, shared knowledge about crop rotation and preservation. We would show them that cooperation benefits everyone, not just those with the most power." It was an appealing vision, but Serena was learning to look beyond the surface of things. What's the cost? Nothing this important comes without a price. Damien smiled, and she realized she was beginning to recognize the different types of his smiles. This one was approving. "Very good. You're thinking like your mother. The cost is that you would become a target for those who profit from the current system. Your father, for one. The Brotherhood of Righteous Men, for another." Serena had heard whispers about the Brotherhood, a group of the village's most conservative men who met in secret and claimed to be guardians of tradition. What would they do? Try to discredit you, Mrs. Whitmore said bluntly. Spread rumors, question your virtue, maybe even stage some sort of incident to prove you're unfit for such responsibility. The familiar knot of fear formed in Serena's stomach, but alongside it was something new, anger. Not the helpless rage she'd felt in the village square, but a clean, purposeful fury at the injustice of it all. How long do I have to decide? Take all the time you need, Damien said. But know that whether you choose to help with the covenant or not, you're welcome here for as long as you wish to stay. The next few days fell into a rhythm that Serena found surprisingly comfortable. Mornings were spent with Mrs. Whitmore, learning the management of the household and beginning to understand the complex web of relationships that kept the valley functioning. Afternoons were often spent in the library with Damien, reading about the history of the old pact and the various attempts to modify it over the centuries. It was during one of these sessions that she made a discovery that changed everything. She was examining a collection of documents related to water rights when she found a letter in her father's handwriting, dated just 2 years earlier. As she read it, her blood went cold. Lord Damien, she called, her voice tight with shock. He looked up from his own reading, took one look at her face, and was beside her in an instant. What is it? Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. She watched his expression darken as he read her father's proposal to sell the secret recipe for the mill's special grain treatment, a formula that had been in her family for generations, in exchange for protection and favorable consideration in future disputes. He was trying to buy influence, she said, when Damien finished reading. Using something that wasn't even his to sell. The recipe came from my mother's family. The letter is dated after your confrontation with Aldrich, Damien observed. He was already planning to use you as a bargaining chip, one way or another. The betrayal cut deep, but it also clarified things. Her father hadn't acted out of righteous anger or family honor. He had acted out of greed and cowardice, willing to sacrifice his own daughter to protect his standing in the community. There's something else, Damien said quietly. Look at the date of my response. Serena found the reply letter and gasped. Damien had refused her father's offer, but more than that, he had sent word immediately to the community radio station and to several of the village's respected elders, informing them of the proposal and its rejection. You exposed him? I exposed the attempt to corrupt the pact for personal gain, Damien corrected. Your father's reputation suffered, but that was his own doing. Serena felt pieces clicking into place. That's why he was so angry when you refused his delivery of me. You'd already humiliated him once by rejecting his bribe. And now his position in the community is precarious, Damien agreed, which makes him more dangerous, not less. A man with nothing left to lose will take greater risks. As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the library doorway, her face grim. There's news from the village, she said. Thomas has been gathering signatures for a petition. What kind of petition? Serena asked, though she suspected she already knew. One demanding that the assembly vote to ban any future modifications to the old pact, Mrs. Whitmore replied. He's claiming that recent events prove the covenant is under attack by outside influences. The accusation was clear. Serena was the outside influence, corrupting the traditional order simply by existing outside her father's control. How many signatures does he have? Damien asked. 17 so far, but he's offering discounts on flour to anyone who signs, Mrs. Whitmore said with disgust. And the Brotherhood is supporting him. Serena felt the walls closing in. If her father succeeded in gathering enough support, any chance of reforming the pact would be lost. More women would suffer what she had suffered. And worse. What can we do? We prepare our own petition, Damien said. One that shows the community what they stand to gain from a more equitable covenant. And if that's not enough, Damien's smile was sharp as a blade. Then we remind them that the old pact requires unanimous consent for any binding changes. And we make sure at least one person refuses to give it. The challenge was clear. Her father was trying to use the same system that had oppressed her to prevent anyone else from escaping that oppression. But two could play that game. I'll need to go back to the village, Serena said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. If we're going to counter his petition, people need to see that I'm not some corrupted creature or helpless victim. They need to see that I made a choice, and I'm thriving because of it. That's dangerous, Mrs. Whitmore warned. Thomas won't welcome you back, and the Brotherhood might see your return as provocation. Let them, Serena said, touching her mother's pendant. It was warm against her palm, confirming what her heart already knew. I'm not the same person who left that village in shame, and it's time they learned that. The next morning, as rain clouds gathered on the horizon and the air grew thick with the promise of the season's first real storm, Serena prepared to face her past. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. This time, she had allies, knowledge, and most importantly, the unshakable certainty that she deserved better than what they had tried to give her. The real battle for the soul of the Covenant was about to begin. The return to the village was nothing like Serena had imagined. She had expected whispers, stares, perhaps even open hostility. What she hadn't expected was the small group of women waiting for her at the edge of the market square, led by young Mira, the baker's daughter. The same Mira whose brother had tried to force himself on Serena just months ago. "We heard you were coming back," Mira said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter of her hands. "We wanted to thank you." Serena blinked in surprise. "Thank me?" "For standing up to my brother," Mira continued, her cheeks flushing. "What he did to you, it wasn't the first time, but you were the first one brave enough to fight back, and it made the rest of us realize we didn't have to just endure it." Behind Mira stood 5 other young women, their faces showing a mixture of determination and fear. Serena recognized them all. Girls she had grown up with, but had never been particularly close to, separated as they were by the cruel hierarchies of village life. "We've been meeting," said Clara, the weaver's daughter, "sharing our stories, supporting each other. Some of the older women have joined us too, Mrs. Hendricks from the bakery, Widow Morrison, even your father's sister, Aunt Bethany." The revelation that her own aunt, a woman who had barely spoken to her since her mother's death, was part of this group sent a shock through Serena's system. "Aunt Bethany? She's been talking about your mother," Mira explained. "About the work she did here, at the manor. How she helped negotiate fair terms during the last drought. Your aunt said your mother would be proud to see you following in her footsteps." Serena felt tears prick her eyes. In all her planning for this return, she had focused on the opposition she would face, not the support she might find. "What do you need from me?" "We want to present our own petition at the assembly," Clara said. "One that supports the changes Lord Damien has been discussing. But we need someone to speak for us, someone who has the courage to stand before the entire community. Someone who can't be dismissed as easily as the rest of us," added another girl whose name Serena couldn't quite remember. The weight of responsibility settled on Serena's shoulders, but it felt different from the crushing burden her father had tried to impose. This was a choice, freely made, with people who respected her judgment rather than seeking to control her. "I'll do it," she said without hesitation, "but I'll need your help preparing. If we're going to change things, we need to do it right." Over the following weeks, as the rains grew heavier and the assembly date approached, Serena found herself at the center of a transformation she could never have imagined. The women's group, they had started calling themselves the Circle of Voices, met regularly in different homes, carefully avoiding the attention of the Brotherhood while building their case for reform. They documented everything: instances of unfair treatment, economic disparities that favored men over women, examples of the old pact being used to silence dissent rather than ensure justice. They also reached out to other villages in the valley, discovering that their experiences were not unique. But it was Mrs. Whitmore who provided the breakthrough they needed. "I've been going through the manor's archives," she said during one of their planning sessions in the Rose Room, "and I found something interesting about the original pact." She spread out a collection of ancient documents on Serena's desk, their parchment yellowed with age. The very first version required that any major changes be proposed by a representative of each affected group, not just the village elders, but also the women, the young people, the craftsmen, and the farmers. Serena studied the faded text, her excitement growing. So the current system, where only the village council can propose changes, is actually a violation of the original agreement. Precisely, Mrs. Whitmore confirmed. And according to this clause here, any citizen can call for a return to original terms if they can demonstrate that the current interpretation serves only a select few rather than the community as a whole. It was the weapon they needed. Not just a petition for change, but a demand for the restoration of democratic principles that had been quietly eroded over generations. Armed with this knowledge, Serena felt confident as the day of the assembly approached. But her father had not been idle either. The confrontation came 3 days before the assembly, when Thomas appeared at the manor's gates with a group of men from the Brotherhood. Mrs. Whitmore answered their demands for entry with cool politeness, but it was clear they weren't going to be deterred easily. "I want to speak with my daughter," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I have every right to see her." Serena, watching from an upstairs window, felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. But alongside the fear was something new. Anger at his presumption that he still had any claim over her choices. "Let him in," she told Mrs. Whitmore. "But only him. The others can wait outside." When Thomas entered the manor's great hall, he looked smaller than Serena remembered. The months of stress and diminished standing in the community had taken their toll, aging him in ways that went beyond mere time. "You look well," he said, and there was something almost like surprise in his voice. "I am well," Serena replied evenly. "Better than I've been in years." They faced each other across the polished floor, the space between them feeling like a chasm. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "This foolishness has gone on long enough, Serena. Come home. I've arranged for you to marry Willem the blacksmith's son. He's willing to overlook recent events in exchange for your mother's grain recipe." The offer was so typical of her father, reducing her to a commodity to be traded, her value measured only in what economic benefit she could provide. But what struck her most was how little it affected her now. The words that once would have crushed her spirit barely registered as more than noise. "No," she said simply. "No?" Thomas's face began to redden. "You ungrateful?" "I am grateful," Serena interrupted. "Grateful to discover that I don't have to accept whatever scraps of dignity you're willing to throw me. Grateful to learn that I have value beyond what you've told me. You have responsibilities," Thomas snapped, "to your family, to your community." "I am fulfilling my responsibilities," Serena said, her voice growing stronger. "To my mother's memory, to the women who need someone to speak for them, to the future generations who deserve better than what we've settled for." Thomas's control cracked completely. "You think that creature upstairs cares about you? You think this is anything more than some elaborate game to him? He's using you, Serena, just like he used your mother before she came to her senses and married me." The words hung in the air like poison, and Serena felt something cold settle in her chest. "What do you mean, like he used my mother?" But Thomas had realized he'd said too much. His face went pale and he took a step backward. "Nothing. I meant nothing by it. Tell me." Serena's voice was deadly quiet. "Tell me what you know about my mother and Lord Damien." When Thomas remained silent, it was Damien himself who answered from the stairway. He descended with fluid grace, his expression carefully neutral, but Serena could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Your mother and I were close," he said carefully, "before she chose to marry your father." The words hit Serena like a physical blow. Close. What did that mean? Had her mother been just another woman seduced by the Lord of the Heights? Had everything she'd learned about Elena's work as a consultant been a lie? "How close?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Damien met her eyes without flinching. "We were lovers," he said simply. "For 2 years. She was brilliant, passionate, and completely dedicated to making life better for everyone in the valley. I loved her. And she left you for him?" Serena gestured toward her father, unable to keep the confusion from her voice. "She left me because she was pregnant," Damien said quietly. "And she wanted her child to grow up human, not caught between two worlds." The revelation hit Serena like lightning. Pregnant. Her mother had been pregnant when she married Thomas, which meant, "You're my father," she whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas's face had gone from red to gray. and his eyes held a mixture of rage and something that might have been relief at finally having the secret exposed. "She made me promise never to tell you," Damien said, his voice heavy with old pain. "She said you deserved to grow up in the human world, to make your own choices about where you belonged. I honored that promise until I chose to come here myself," Serena finished. "Until you proved you had her strength and her principles," Damien corrected. "Until it became clear that you were going to change things, whether I helped you or not." Serena sank into one of the hall's chairs, overwhelmed. Everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, her place in the world, had just been overturned. But as the shock faded, other pieces began falling into place. Why the pendant had always been warm against her skin. Why she had felt so at home in the manor. Why Damien had chosen her not just for her principles, but because he had recognized something deeper. "Does this change anything?" Thomas asked, his voice bitter. "Does knowing the truth about her parentage make her any less my daughter in the eyes of the law?" "It changes everything," Serena said, rising from her chair with newfound purpose. "Because it means I'm not just some village girl asking for charity. I'm the daughter of the Lord of the Heights, with every right to demand that the pact be honored in its original form." The look of dawning horror on Thomas's face was almost worth 20 years of his neglect and cruelty. "You can't prove it," he said desperately. "I don't need to prove it," Serena replied. "I just need to claim it, and I do. I claim my heritage, my mother's legacy, and my right to speak for those who have been silenced." The Assembly of Rain took place 3 days later as the season's heaviest downpour hammered against the roof of the community hall. Nearly every adult in the valley was present, crowded into the large space with water dripping from their cloaks and steam rising from their bodies. Serena stood at the front of the hall, flanked by the women of the Circle of Voices. She wore her mother's pendant openly and the green dress that had belonged to Elena. In her hands were the original documents Mrs. Whitmore had found, along with the petitions that represented months of careful work. Thomas sat in the front row with the other village elders, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The Brotherhood filled several rows behind him, while Damien stood at the back of the hall, his presence a reminder of the supernatural forces that were part of this community, whether they acknowledged it or not. "Citizens of the valley," Serena began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "We gather tonight to honor the ancient traditions of the Assembly of Rain, where our ancestors came together to make decisions that would affect all our lives." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, but all were paying attention. "I stand before you not as a rebellious daughter or a corrupted woman, but as the heir to Elena of the Mill, who served this community faithfully as human consultant to the Lord of the Heights. I stand before you with evidence that our current interpretation of the old pact violates the original agreement our ancestors made." A murmur went through the crowd, but Serena pressed on. The original pact required that all voices be heard before major decisions were made. Women's voices, young people's voices, the voices of farmers and craftsmen and everyone who makes this community work. Over the years, that requirement has been forgotten and power has been concentrated in the hands of a few. "This is nonsense," Thomas interrupted, rising from his seat. "The girl has been corrupted by..." "By what?" Serena asked, her voice cutting through his protest. "By learning to read? By discovering that I have the right to refuse an unwanted marriage? By finding out that my mother was respected and valued for her mind, not just her ability to produce sons?" The words hit their target. Several women in the crowd nodded, and Serena saw her Aunt Bethany stand up in support. "I propose that we return to the original terms of the pact," Serena continued. "That we establish a true council with representatives from every group in our community. That we end the practice of using the pact to silence dissent or control women. And that we work together to build something better than what we've inherited." She held up the ancient documents. "These are the original terms, written by our ancestors and witnessed by both human and supernatural authorities. They guarantee rights that have been forgotten and protections that have been ignored." As she read from the documents, detailing the democratic principles that had once governed their community, Serena could see opinions shifting in the crowd. The original pact wasn't the tool of oppression it had become. It was a framework for cooperation and mutual respect. When she finished, the hall erupted in discussion. Some shouted support, others voiced objections. But for the first time in years, everyone was part of the conversation. The formal vote, when it came, was closer than Serena had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. The return to original terms passed by a margin of 23 votes, with the women of the circle providing the crucial swing. But as the crowd began to disperse into the rainy night, Thomas made one last desperate play. "This vote is invalid," he declared, his voice echoing through the hall. "The girl who led this rebellion is not who she claims to be. She is the bastard daughter of the vampire with no legal standing in this community." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Serena felt every eye in the hall turn to her, waiting to see how she would respond. She could deny it, could claim that Thomas was lying out of spite, could try to maintain the fiction that had shaped her entire life. Instead, she chose truth. "He's right," she said clearly. "Elena of the Mill was my mother, but Thomas was not my father. My father is Damien, Lord of the Heights, and I am proud to claim that heritage." The gasps that followed were audible even over the rain, but Serena wasn't finished. "But my parentage doesn't invalidate anything we've accomplished here tonight. If anything, it proves that cooperation between our communities is not only possible, but natural. I am living proof that the divide between human and supernatural is one we've created, not one that has to exist." She turned to face the crowd fully, her mother's pendant warm against her throat. The original pact recognized that strength comes from diversity, that wisdom comes from hearing all voices, that justice requires the consent of the governed. Those principles don't change based on who my father is. They matter because they're right. The vote to confirm the evening's decisions was even more decisive than the first. Whatever shock people felt at learning of Serena's parentage was outweighed by the undeniable truth of her arguments. As the assembly finally ended and people began filing out into the storm, Damien approached Serena. For the first time since she had learned the truth, they were alone together. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Serena considered the question. Was she all right? Her entire life had been turned upside down. She had discovered that everything she thought she knew about her family was a lie. She had claimed a heritage that would change how everyone saw her forever. And yet, "I'm better than all right," she said, surprising herself with how true it was. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am and what I'm meant to do." Damien smiled, and this time it was the warmest, most genuine expression she had seen from him. "Your mother would be so proud." "I hope so," Serena replied, "because this is just the beginning." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the valley clean and feeding the rivers that would sustain them through the coming season. In the manor house, Mrs. Whitmore was preparing a celebration feast. In the village, the Circle of Voices was already planning their first official meeting as part of the new council. And in the great hall where history had been made, Serena stood with her father, her real father, and looked toward a future that would be built on truth, cooperation, and the radical idea that everyone deserved a voice in their own destiny. The old pact was dead. The new covenant had begun. And Serena, daughter of two worlds, would help guide it into being.